Core. Yeah. So, welcome everyone. Tonight, as I've kind of advertised this in various sessions, I came across an article that was something brand new for me, and it has to do with the nature of Torah. The article, and I'll put it up on the screen in a moment, is called "The Deliberately Flawed Divine Torah," and the concept is a very interesting one. Uh, it's that I think most of us are familiar, and Henry and I were talking about this uh, earlier, with the documentary hypothesis, which is the idea that there are at least four um, distinct authors that we can trace in the Torah. And if nothing else, you can trace them grammatically by the way they refer to God. Some refer to God as Yud He Vav He, which is called the J text. Some refer to God primarily as Elohim, which is the E text. Some are primarily concerned with priestly issues and the tabernacle and forms of sacrifice and worship, and that is the P text for priest. And then Deuteronomy seems like it's literally in a class by itself, so that's called the D text. And then, of course, because people need to get doctoral theses, people keep studying and studying, so they dissect it and dissect it and dissect it. And of course, at the other end of there's H1, H2, different the anyway, yeah. So people have gone beyond just the four, and
Or you go to
so
you go to Friedman's book and he color codes it
yeah, Henry
as
was
each
talking about that.
is.
Yep. Yes. So
Should be either C or K for Cohen rather than P for priest.
well, it's whoever wrote the first paper. I mean, because the early papers were, I can't remember the author, but yeah, and in fact, the Y J text
And,
rather than Y text.
and do we know who any of these people were, or we just?
Yeah, God, I can't remember the name of the author. German author, which is why it's a J text, because Yahweh, in German, the word Yah meaning yes is spelled with a J. So what we associate with a Y sound in German is a J sound. I can't remember. It's just slipping my mind the name of the author. I'll probably remember it as we go on. Maybe it's even in the article. So, and now, of course, a traditional Jew would say, no, the Torah is literally, I'll just say the Orthodox approach would be, the Torah is literally the word of God, and there seems to be apparent discrepancies, but when we dig deeper, we understand the reason that they are not really discrepancies. And I'll just give I'll give a couple of examples. And I think actually this article is going to go into some of the interesting discussions as well. So, for example, in the opening of Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, you have 6 days of creation, and God creates humanity, male and female, and there's all the animals, and the grasses have sprouted, and everything's great. Then all of a sudden, we are in the middle of chapter 2, verse 4. In the second half of verse 4, we're in the Garden of Eden, and there's no man, there's no woman, grasses haven't sprouted, and so on. And then God makes grasses sprout, and makes Adam, who is presumably male, and then does surgery on Adam and turns either a rib or some other thing into woman. So those seem to be clearly inconsistent. But what the rabbis would say is, yes, the grasses were made, but they hadn't yet sprouted. And that the first Adam was hermaphrodite, so he was both male and female. And then the surgery was to split the male side from the female side. Or the first woman was Lilith, and she exits the scene because Adam gets mad at her. So the rabbis have explanations of why the Torah can be literally true, and usually through Midrash solve all the problems. Another perfect example is when they talk about Noah's Ark. Almost in consecutive sentences, you have a description that there were two of every kind of animal, male and female, and almost in the next sentence you have one pair of unclean animals and 7 pairs of clean animals. So, of course, what the rabbis say is 7 pairs of kosher animals. So when Noah finally gets on land and you have to start sacrificing animals, there are enough animals to sacrifice. Because if you start sacrificing, an animal of which there's only one male and one female, that animal no longer exists. So a traditional rabbi, a traditional Jew would never say that there are different authors of the text. So this article that we're going to read, I find fascinating because we have a very traditional Jew who says the Torah is deliberately flawed. So it has these different voices which seem inconsistent, but that is a deliberate process. And this is an idea I've never run into. And so I'm fascinated by it. And so I will force you to suffer through it. So any thoughts or questions before we jump into it?
I got 2.
Yes.
Okay, these various authors that we know exist because of the differences in the grammar and whatever.
Right.
Do we know who any of them are?
I'm not aware of anyone who has identified it. No. So the answer is no.
Okay.
And I think basically, I don't think they are individual authors, but I think the speculation is, for example, the J text comes from the 2 southern tribes, and the E text comes from the northern tribes, because Israel, if you follow the chronology in the Bible, Israel is at one point 12 unified tribes, and then basically after Solomon, there's a split in the nation, and so you have the northern tribes, which are called Israel, and then the 2 southern tribes are called Judah. And I think scholars sort of attribute the J text to Judah and the E text to the northern tribes. But I don't think there's an individual author. In a way, it's kind of similar to my understanding. I'll defer to Jim on this one. That the Gospels, we have Matthew and the four Gospels. While I would say some people would say that they're literally written by one person, I think it's more a different groups historically. Jim, you have your hand raised.
I was just going to add that, talking about Orthodox rabbis, the same thing exists in not Catholicism, but in fundamentalist Christian religions. Same thing. No, Moses wrote all 5 books, and they're all, there's no errors in any of them. So
yes, and we do see that in sort of fundamentalist Christianity. And one of my teachers would say, at least you should read it in Hebrew and Greek if you're going to accept it as, literally from the Word of God. Because once you start translating, as we've talked a lot in these discussions, once you start translating, you are picking a particular interpretation. So if it's the Word of God, presumably it wasn't English as the Word of God. It was for a Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is mostly Hebrew. There's I think a section of Daniel, which is in Aramaic. I can't remember if it's like a third of Daniel or 2/3 of Daniel. I can never remember. And of course, the New Testament is all written in biblical Greek. So let's, Farah, did you have something?
Yeah, they say, when they said that God made the man, it was male and female. And I understand it was another, they speak about the Torah says that woman size, but Lilith, do you heard about that? Lilith is the female side that God made man and woman. 4 gender together. And then this one was the Lilith, the lady.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different interpretations. But if you think about it, what the rabbis are struggling to do is you have 2 texts which are clearly inconsistent. So the rabbis have to say they're not inconsistent because it's all written by God. So through Midrash, they have to come up with a way of understanding the text. So that's sort of the classic process. And what we're going to read about is a very different process. Okay, and so let me pop it up on the screen. And here we go. Okay. Oh, boy. Okay. So the Torah, this is from Torah.com. Usually very detailed articles, and I think very carefully thought out articles. I'll just read the introduction, and then we'll see if Joanne's up to reading.
Yeah, I'll read.
Okay. The deliberately flawed divine Torah. We are God's partners in fixing the ethical flaws in the Torah. Halachic loopholes are not dishonest or deceptive. They are part of the design. And this author, I'm just going to slide all the way down, is I don't know where Gateshead is. It sounds like England, and a doctorate, but he's a founder of a Beit Midrash in Jerusalem, author of 13 books, numerous articles in both English and Hebrew. And I think it's pretty clear he is writing from an Orthodox perspective. So let me see. I think I'll read the introduction. Sorry to be so confusing here. Oh, and there's a picture of a 19th century Torah text.
Nice.
So he writes, I believe the Torah is min hashamayim, from heaven, and that every word is divine and holy. But I don't believe that the Torah is always historically true. Sometimes it seems like divine fiction, or that it is uninfluenced by external sources. On top of this, I'm reminded of the observation by the famous Hasidic leader, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, who suggested that the children of Israel heard only the Aleph of Anochi of the Ten Commandments, which means they didn't hear anything, since one can pronounce the Aleph. This is something I think I discussed in the Kabbalah class. There's a whole discussion about what the people actually heard, because they talk about God speaking, and then very quickly God is speaking to Moses. So there's a discussion about what the people heard, and some say they only heard the first commandment, and then some say they only heard the first word, which is Anochi. First word is Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am Adonai your God. And then there's even a speculation that they only heard the Aleph, which of course is a silent letter. Nor do I believe, he continues, that the laws literally interpreted are all morally acceptable. They are not. Rather, I believe that the Torah is often morally, deeply, and deliberately flawed, and furthermore, God himself intentionally made it flawed. It is the latter issue I will discuss in this essay. So that to me is radical and even somewhat alarming. So that's why it's fun. Far-fetched arguments and halachic loopholes. Joanne, if you would like to read.
My belief that the Torah is morally flawed is closely related to an altogether different topic, the halachic loophole, which Chazal and later poskim, halachic decisors, frequently use to solve halachic problems.
And I'll just interject. The word Chazal is an acronym like NASA. It means Chachmenu Zichronam Lavracha. Our sages, may their memory be a blessing. So it's an abbreviation, very common in rabbinic writing. Okay.
Many of these loopholes are legal fictions the rabbis employ to deliberately ignore straightforward biblical pasukim, verses, or halachic standards. In doing so, they often made use of far-fetched arguments and twists that violated the very intent of these verses or halachic norms, and they seem to have done so with no compunctions and without it becoming a major issue. To the rabbis, this method was seemingly a normal procedure whenever it was convenient to achieve their goals. To us, however, some of these loopholes are not only far-fetched, but misleading and seem like manifestations of trickery.
There is a sort of rabbinic truism that where there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way, which is one way of saying that if the rabbis want to do something, they can figure out a way to do it. And, I think one of the examples they're even going to look at is 3 times it says eye for an eye. And the rabbis proved that God couldn't possibly have meant eye for an eye, even though it's mentioned 3 times. So either you think the rabbis are sort of being dishonest in their analysis and just doing what they want to do, but this author is going further. Okay.
The sages declared that the following Torah laws never were and never will be. Ben Sorar Umarei, the stubborn and rebellious son who had to be killed. Ir Hanedachat, the subversive city which had to be entirely destroyed because its inhabitants worshipped idolatry. In addition to this, they decided that lex talionis, the principle of an eye for an eye, meant financial compensation, while the text does not even hint at this. To solve the problems of mamzer, a child born from an adulterous relationship, they invented mechanisms that the Torah never mentioned. There are numerous other cases. In all these instances, the rabbi used arguments that are highly problematic and seemingly dishonest and deceptive. How did they do so with a clear conscience?
I appreciate that he speculates that rabbis have a conscience. And so another thing I should mention, when he's talking about rabbis here, he is talking about Chazal. Chachmeinu Zichram Levracha. So these are the rabbis of the Talmud. I would say starting with Mishnah and continuing through the Talmudic era. So we're talking probably about 700 years, from about 200 BCE to about 500 Common Era. We're not talking about me and my buddies, although I must admit rabbis continue to do these kinds of things.
The Torah as a divine compromise. We believe that a profound reason stands behind the sages' willingness to adjust the Torah in this manner. While the sages believe that the Torah is absolutely divine, they did not see it as the final text or teaching. They realized that the Torah text was a stage in God's plan at a particular moment in Jewish history. Revelation is a response to the human longing for a relationship with God. Thus, it can succeed only to the extent that human beings can relate to it. The divine will, therefore, is limited by what human beings are able to pragmatically and spiritually understand and accomplish at a given time and in a given place.
So to kind of warn you as to what's coming here, the author is going to say, well, this text, the Torah, was given to Jews. Certainly, when scholars would say the Torah reached its current form in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is about 4th, 5th century BCE. So it's at least 2,500 years old. So it had to make sense to people living in that time, and and not necessarily make the same level of sense to people living in our time.
The Torah is anthropocentric while its aspirations are theocentric.
Hold on a second. We should just stop, take a deep breath, and admire that sentence. And good, the author is going to say, in other words, because it's not obvious what that sentence means.
In other words, while the divine will may want to accomplish the ultimate, it is constrained by the limitations of human ability. The Torah, then, is really a divine compromise, filtered through the mindset and mores of its intended audience. It is therefore flawed in the sense that it must sometimes allow or introduce laws that are far from ideal, but were the best possible option at the time they were revealed to the Jewish people. Or, like in other cases, were never meant to be applied literally.
Right, and we'll see what he's talking
See
about.
later.
So, Torah anthropocentric, namely, the Torah is designed to speak to people, while its aspirations are theocentric. Its aspirations are how God feels and what God is trying to teach.
Maimonides, the outdated nature of the sacrificial cult. One famous example is given by Maimonides in his Guide of the Perplexed regarding the sacrificial cult in the tabernacle and later in the temple. He suggests that the Torah carefully limited the already existing practice of sacrifice and kept it for the sole purpose of weaning the Jewish people away from the primitive rituals of their idolatrous neighbors. In other words, Maimonides believed that the sacrificial cult in Judaism was established as a compromise to human weakness.
Okay, let's see the quote.
For a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible, and therefore man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. Therefore he, may he be exalted, suffered the above mentioned kinds of worship to remain, but transferred them from created or imaginary and unreal things to his own name, commanding us to practice them with regard to him.
Let's read a little more, and I'll comment. Maybe people will have questions.
To give the sacrificial cult a more sophisticated, dignified, and monotheistic meaning, the Torah introduced many laws to refine this kind of worship. This would slowly move people towards being able to have it abolished altogether, which was the divine objective.
Let me just comment. What Maimonides is saying is, we certainly today would think that the concept of animal sacrifice, not to mention human sacrifice, is not something that we're very comfortable with as a way of relating to God. But of course, in the time of the Torah, every religion related to their gods using sacrificial animals and grains and other things. So what Maimonides is saying is that had the Torah basically done completely away with sacrifice and instituted prayer, just as an example, people wouldn't know what to make of it. It would be so far from the accepted path that it would be unrecognizable as an aspect of divine worship. So therefore, what Maimonides is arguing, and I can't remember, how detailed the article will go into this, is a sacrificial system was set up, first, eliminating human sacrifice and so on, but also at only one place in the world, which is really in the book of Deuteronomy, that you can only have animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem, with the idea that at some point in time, Jews are going to leave Jerusalem or be kicked out of Jerusalem. And so therefore, the sacrificial system will become obsolete and Jews will have to replace it with something else. I think that's basically Maimonides' argument. Henry.
I find that interesting in the fact that something you brought up Monday night in the session was about the Messiah and about the belief that when the Messiah comes, for some very stringent Orthodox people, the return of the sacrifices and so forth on the Temple Mount. And yet Maimonides here is kind of dissuading that idea.
Yes.
And so forth. And Maimonides is someone highly respected, even among the very Orthodox people, correct? So it seems interesting.
Now he is. He was actually quite controversial in his time because he actually, and I think we've discussed this, he did something very revolutionary, and that is to start developing an organized theology of Judaism. I've said this many times. The rabbis in the Talmud, Maimonides is writing about 500 years after the Talmud is closed. The rabbis in the Talmud weren't concerned with theology at all. They were really more concerned with what is it we're supposed to do. Theology as an idea, what's the nature of God? What's the nature of Scripture? How does all of it fit together? My understanding here is historically, Maimonides, of course, is living in Spain, where also you have Muslim philosophers starting to develop an organized theology of Islam. So Maimonides wants to develop an organized theology of Judaism, which was quite controversial at the time. Maimonides now is very well respected, but was very controversial in his own time. And then there's great disagreement. So the classic belief is that when the Messiah comes, the temple will be rebuilt, we've got a minor problem in that there's something called the Dome of the Rock sitting on that particular piece of real estate. Um, but nonetheless, the third temple will be built and that animal sacrifice will be restored. But then the question is, what sacrifices? If there's no sin, if the Messiah redeems the world of sin, then you won't have sin offerings. So there's a lot of speculation. To my knowledge, there's nothing authoritative written about what sacrifices endure. Some people will say it's only well-being offerings. They're called shlemut. Another concept is the only holiday that will be celebrated will be Purim. And I don't know how they got to Purim, but it's a happy holiday and so on. But there's not, when people ask, what will the world be like after the Messiah comes? That's a classic God knows question. There's nobody really knows. And let's see, okay. I think we're, but there's definitely a difference there between what Maimonides is suggesting and what traditional Judaism would hold. I think we're up to here, still the numerous. Hold on, Les. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, you're saying something that is controversial now because you say when the Messiah comes, and now it's being thought of as a messianic age, not a specific individual. So that's greatly changed.
Well, so what I would say is I was trying to represent a traditional perspective, but the Reform perspective, you're right, is a messianic age. But then the same question arises. When the messianic age is here, is the temple going to be rebuilt? Are we going to restore animal sacrifice? I would say among most of my rabbinic colleagues in the Reform movement, they would say, yes, there's an idea of a messianic age, but I don't think they would say that the temple is going to be rebuilt and we're going to resume animal sacrifice. But
when they say messianic age, they don't believe that there'll be quote unquote a Messiah that brings in the messianic age. I don't quite understand that.
Yeah. So basically, my simple-minded understanding of this is the Messiah is to usher in a time of world peace, no more disease, no more hunger, everything's great. Right. So the question is that done mystically with the arrival of some guy who will be the king of Israel? And, in some traditional perspectives on the Messiah will almost have like prophetic-like powers. I mean, after all, Moses, through God, Moses splits the sea. Elijah and Elisha raise people from the dead. There's all kinds of mystical stuff going on. Or I would say the preponderance of Reform perspective is we like this idea of making the world a better place. And it's through our actions that the world will be made a better place. Now, whether that will actually ever result in a moment where everything is perfect or whether it's a process. And there's one perspective which is about Maimonides. Maimonides has a series of statements called his 13 Articles of Faith. And one of them is, I believe with perfect faith, in the coming of the Messiah. And so people who have dissected that idea says Maimonides really doesn't believe that a Messiah is going to be here, but he likes the idea of this process of the coming of the Messiah, which I would say is also sort of a Reform perspective, more to tikkun olam, that, when we make peace among nations, when we heal disease and so on, that is moving toward a messianic age. But again, Judaism is much more focused typically on how you hang your mezuzah, what food's kosher, what food is not kosher, rather than what's the nature of the Messiah, what's the nature of the messianic age, what will happen, when the Messiah comes. You can have all kinds of beliefs about that. The Judaism focuses on what you're supposed to do much more than what you're supposed to believe. Okay, let's continue. Still the numerous and intricate
sacrificial laws in the Torah, carefully detailed in the oral law, have tremendous symbolic and educational meaning far beyond the actual sacrificial deed. Many of them paradoxically make the worshiper sensitive to higher standards, leading to genuine monotheism. This means that while one should really outgrow the actual sacrificial deed, the many spiritual messages behind these laws remain relevant even to this day.
Okay. I think he talks more about this later.
Hebrew slavery. The same is true about slavery. The fact that the Torah tolerates slavery only means that it was not yet possible to completely abandon it. Former societies would not have been able to sustain themselves economically had slavery come to a sudden end. So the Torah introduced laws to make slavery, at least Hebrew slavery, more ethical by creating much better conditions for slaves, helping them to overcome their slave mentality, and giving them the opportunity to free themselves and start a new life. Only at a later stage could slavery be eliminated altogether. If the Torah was given today, would it have laws on slavery? To take the point one step further, not only would the laws concerning sacrifices and slavery be totally abolished once the people outgrew the need for them, but they would actually not have appeared in the biblical text had it been revealed at a much later stage in the Jewish history.
By the way, if you go to Torah.com, one of the nice things, which I don't have here, is if you hover your cursor over the footnotes, you can read them even while you're reading. But I've included in what I sent to you all the footnotes.
This has enormous consequences for a proper understanding of what Torah in essence is all about. Just as slavery and the cult of sacrifices are compromises to human weakness would not have appeared in the text at a later stage. The same may be said for other problematic laws.
And one interesting thing that this reminds me of is, and I think those of you who have studied with me, but just read the text carefully, know that there is really not much in the Bible, not just the Torah now, but the entire Hebrew Bible about the afterlife. There's a few hints there, but really not much at all. In the Talmud, which comes later, and in medieval writings, there's lots of discussion. But when you read through the New Testament, Christian scripture, and the Quran, there's a lot more on that subject. And actually, some of the writings there even correspond to later Jewish writings. And because it's a different time, you know, so at that time, whether it's Greek philosophy or whatever, people are now used to the idea of thinking about this, so later texts can develop the idea. Okay, let's read here. But whether
or how they would have appeared at a later stage would depend on the moral and religious sophistication of human beings, not on God. The more human beings purge themselves of earlier ideas and practices that still reflect primitive and immoral perceptions, the more the ideal divine law will be able to reveal itself. So the text of the Torah is human in the sense that it is the human condition that will determine what will appear in the divine text and what will not.
So God is, in effect, writing for God's audience. And what were people willing to accept and understand, let's just say 2,500 years ago, or if you take the text literally, 3,200 years ago, which would have been roughly the time of Sinai. Not necessarily we readers today.
Humanity's innate but inchoate moral intuition.
I think incohate is the word, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But a person's obligation is to aim for higher moral and religious standards. Because people are created in the image of God, they carry within themselves moral notions of the highest order, which are very close to God's ultimate will. They may not be aware of them, since they remain subconscious at an early moment in Jewish history, such as at Mount Sinai. But a later stage and throughout all of history, these moral notions slowly develop and come to the forefront. The need to disconnect from Torah. But developing these higher moral notions is possible only if the readers morally disconnect themselves from the biblical text when the text still represents lower moral standards. Would they constantly come back to the text? They would be unable to opt for higher moral and religious goals, since they would consider it to have the final word. The text would then become an obstacle instead of a support system to achieve even higher levels of growth. So rather than the person following the text should follow the person.
I find this fascinating. In a way, I'm really sorry that Bryce is not here, because on Saturdays when Bryce studies with us, he's always pointing out things in the text which are really morally repugnant. And you know, as a Reform rabbi, I could argue that that really isn't God's words, but human words that people writing down what they believe God's words were just crept in. What this author is saying is those were words that made sense at the time, but no longer make sense to us. And that was God's will. That was God's intent.
Yeah, I don't see nailing your ear to a door, which is described in a Torah portion as relevant for today, or, some of the rituals when a woman has a baby and you can't have relations with her. It's just nuts.
So let me tell you what some of the rabbis do with that one. They nailing your ear is in Parshat Mishpatim. I think it's like Exodus 21 or so, right after the Ten Commandments. And the subject, I can see Jim is puzzled about this, is if you have a Hebrew slave who has had a wife and children while being a slave, is given the opportunity to be freed, he can be freed, but his wife and children are still the property of the master.
Oh.
And if he, I should really pull up the text, but if he wants to stay with his women, with his wife and children, he is taken by his master, and his ear is nailed to a doorpost, and he has to recite a formula which says, I love my master, okay? And so on. Okay, so on the surface of it, I'm with Cheryl. This doesn't make any sense. But then we got to read it in Hebrew. So we take his ear and we nail it to a doorpost. Anybody know what the Hebrew word for doorpost is? Mezuzah.
Right.
Okay.
Mezuzah.
So his ear is nailed to the mezuzah, and he says, I love my master. Okay.
Mhm.
So in Hebrew, I love my master is ahavti et Adoni. So does that sound familiar to anybody? Ahavti et Adoni.
What, the Vayahafta?
Yes. So the V'ahavta is V'ahavta et Adonai, right? You shall love your God.
Mhm.
And so his ear, which is the organ of listening, like Shema, listen,
Mhm.
is nailed to the mezuzah. So what's in the mezuzah? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Not I love my master, but you shall love God. So what one of my teachers, Mordechai Finley, said, I don't know if this is a traditional teaching or just Mordechai's. What he says is that the text is saying, if you really are loyal to God, you will allow yourself to be freed. You work, earn a few shekels, and then you can buy your wife and children. But if you want to remain a slave, it's because your ear is nailed to loving your slave master rather than loving God. So that's what the rabbis do with this. So, but I'm with you, Cheryl. I don't, it doesn't make
Man,
a
this
lot
is
of sense.
going a little far,
Well, that's the whole process. That's what rabbis do. I would like to say we, but I'm really talking about rabbis 1,500 years ago. Go far because the text doesn't make any sense as it's written. So what the rabbis do in Midrash is exactly what I just described. They will figure out some way to make it make sense to them. And what this author is saying is, no. Slavery was kept in the Torah, but there were so many conditions about how you have to treat slaves that for all practical purposes, it could not endure. At least that's certainly what Maimonides says. And I think that's what this guy is saying as well. Okay.
Weren't slaves freed at Jubilee year? Were the
Yeah,
slaves?
so I slaves are, I think, enslaved for a maximum of 7 years. So and there's also Jubilee. I mean, I don't remember all the details, but yeah, that's some of the processes that are in the Torah that make slavery in effect practically impossible. Okay, let's continue with the need to disconnect from Torah.
I think we just read
We
that.
just read that. Okay,
Yeah.
yes, you're absolutely right. Okay, 21st century Torah.
21st century Torah versus a 3,000-year-old Torah. Were the Torah given today, it would not be the same text that God gave at Sinai. After all, over the many years, people have developed a more sophisticated understanding of moral values. It is true that they have bitterly failed in living by those standards, but there is no doubt that humanity's understanding of what morality should be is far more advanced than it was in the days of the Torah. The unconditional equality of all men, the dignity of all women, Jews and non-Jews, are but a few examples. Yet the drive to reach for these higher levels is inspired by the Torah's introducing such laws as love your neighbor as yourself, and laws that call for sexual restraint, the well-being of the stranger, respecting human dignity, and many others. The Torah gave people a taste of how things really should be. By doing so, it has greatly contributed to the ongoing development of many other values, some of which are not even mentioned in the Torah.
Yeah, so in looking particularly at immigration issues and protecting the rights of the oppressed and widows and orphans and so on, that concept of protecting the powerless is mentioned many times. I think in terms of widows and orphans, I think it's at least 36 times you're commanded to protect the powerless, and those commandments are in the Torah. Now, there are many other ancient legal codes that survive from that time, the Code of Hammurabi, other law codes, and that concept of protecting the powerless in society is not even mentioned once in any of those codes. So I think what he is saying, and which makes sense to me, is at least these ideas are being introduced in the Torah, and it's up to us to work them out.
The paradox of the Torah's ethical charge. Sometimes the Torah's laws reflect the highest standards, and sometimes they do not. Too much theocentric legislation at once would probably have been impossible to accept by a society that was still noted in condition, so at odds with those standards. The resulting Torah is thus a paradoxical mix of sublime divine ideals and primitive human necessities.
Yeah, I was thinking before that in Roman times, maybe it was Greek, but I think it's Roman, the Israelite religion was criticized as being atheist because we worshiped an invisible God. And the idea of worshiping an invisible God was so unusual. No other religions had the concept at that time of an invisible God, that it was criticized as being an atheist religion, that there's no God.
By sustaining this paradox, the text created a vision and aspiration in stages. It gave human beings a feeling of how things should really be, while not yet asking them to go all the way. It reveals an understanding, as Maimonides teaches, that such changes need time to reach human beings, since a person cannot make a sudden transition from one opposite to another. The sage's responsibility to update the text. It is here that one of the most far-reaching ideas in Judaism appears. Instead of God constantly upgrading the text to higher standards according to human capabilities and giving the Torah over and over again, God left in the hands of the sages.
God left it,
I'm sorry,
the process.
Okay. After laying the foundations, God asked the sages to become partners in the creation of the Torah, in the sense that humans would now be able to develop at even higher levels. Just as in the creation chapter, God provides the main ingredients and then asks humanity to fashion the world and improve it. The Torah is presented as the main ingredient and engage with, and improve.
No. Read again. The Torah is
The
presented.
Torah is presented as the main ingredient that the sages must engage with and improve. The text was meant as a point of departure, not as an arrival, and the sages are the ones required to adapt the text. Changing the laws without changing the text. The rabbi's divine mandate to update Judaism and keep its moral development on target was not to be accomplished by changing the underdeveloped, compromised, and flawed divine wording itself by their interpretation of the Torah text, or by advancing ideas and even laws that sometimes required drastic changes, which violated the literal meaning of the verses. That they were willing to do so is now obvious. They felt obligated to do so, since this was the very intention of the text. The divine but flawed texts ask of humans to go beyond it, and sometimes even ignore it. The text demanded its own fundamental renovation.
So I want to emphasize that this process of basically molding the meaning of the text to times as time goes on is an Orthodox thing. It's not just Reform, it is the traditional understanding. So when they say the rabbis, again, they're talking about the rabbis in the Talmudic era, and actually as Jewish law continues to evolve, the legal authorities as time goes on. And what the rabbis did was reform Judaism from a religion based on animal sacrifice to a religion based on prayer and study of sacred text and doing mitzvot. And the Torah doesn't say any of those things. You know, a drastic example of this is there is not one mention in the entire Bible of people getting together to pray as a community, to pray a liturgy, you know, having morning services, afternoon services, evening services. There's not a single example in the Bible of that. There are some prayers. Moses prays that his sister be healed, and you know, individuals pray, but you don't have this concept of community prayer. So the rabbis basically were very consciously adapting the text to their times and to our times. I mean, most dramatically, because there's no temple, you can't do animal sacrifice anymore. So they absolutely understood that it was their obligation to evolve the text. Less.
Where did the rabbis get this divine mandate to update Judaism? Where does this divine mandate come from? Is it from the rabbis self-serving?
No, it's from the myth.
Oh, okay.
And the myth is that Moses received the oral law on Mount Sinai. So the oral law is the basis of the Talmud. Okay? So the divine myth, which you know, we'll see if lightning strikes me, I don't believe is true, but the sacred myth, which is at the foundation of Judaism, is that Moses was given two revelations. One is the written Torah, and the second is the oral Torah, which ultimately becomes the Talmud, which has all of these laws.
I thought the oral Torah becomes the Mishnah, and then the Talmud attempts to explain it.
Well, it's both, because actually the Mishnah is about 1/6 of the total oral law. The other oral laws are called in the Talmud Baraitas. I think you probably heard the term, and they are in Hebrew. They're not in Aramaic. It's clear that you have the Mishnah, which is what Yehud Hanassi thought was the most important part of the oral law, so that instead of it remaining oral, he wrote it down in a text called the Mishnah. And for the next few hundred years, the rabbis discussed the Mishnah, bringing in other oral laws, which are Baraitas, and just their own logic to develop Judaism and Jewish law. And it's sort of like, you know, I give you a seed, okay? And you plant the seed and an apple tree grows. So did I give you just the seed, or did I give you the capability to have an apple tree? So I think what the understanding is that the oral law are the seeds, and the sprouting of the seeds are what the rabbis did then and are continually doing in the Talmud and even beyond, to allow Judaism to grow and flourish and adapt to the times. But it's a Yeah, it's not simple. Okay. Let's see. I think we're up to here. Changing the laws without changing the text.
No, we read
We
that.
did that?
You did
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just see how much more we have to go. We actually do have a fair amount. Let's do one or maybe two examples. So let's return to the four examples.
For examples of rabbinic updating. Let us return to the four examples with which we opened the piece. Ben Soror Umareh, rebellious son. The Torah commands that a stubborn and rebellious son must be put to death. The rabbis were of the opinion that this law could never have been enforced, since it completely violates the moral spirit of the Torah, even by its lower standard at Sinai. They therefore declared that such a law is only theoretical. There never was a stubborn and rebellious son, and never will be. Its message was purely educational. There are many important lessons to be learned from this so-called commandment, but that it should actually be implemented is not one of them. To get rid of the law, the rabbis started reading the text so literally, using every means of deduction and legal hair splitting, that it became totally impossible to enforce the law. So, for example, the rabbis interpret the phrase, "He doesn't listen to our voice," in Devarim 21:20 to mean that the father and mother must speak in the identical voice, a state of affairs that is all but physically impossible. Then they add for good measure that the parents must also be the same height and have the same base.
So let me just comment more on this particular one, and we'll pick it up also next time. So the Torah portion says you have a stubborn and rebellious son. So presumably this is not an adult, right? It's a child.
Mhm.
So now the question is, at what age must this child be? So if the child, let's just talk about, first of all, it's a son. So all the girls are off the hook because they talk about a son. So how old is this son? So if the son is over 13, the son is an adult and he's responsible for his own sins. So that this doesn't apply. If he's under 13, then he's not responsible for his sins. So this shouldn't apply. So there's discussion at Talmud. I don't remember whether they has to be on his 13th birthday or maybe in his 13th year. I don't remember the exact commentary, but it's very limited in terms of time. And then the comment that they mentioned, he doesn't listen to our voice. Einenu shema b'kolenu. So our voice, meaning the father and the mother, have to have identical voices for this to apply. And then it says they take him by the hand. So if they take him by the hand, they have to have identical stature, which I think is mentioned here. And then they just keep going on and they have an argument about what is a stubborn and rebellious son. Well, one who is a drunkard. Well, how much does he have to drink? A drunken and a glutton, I think the text actually says. Well, how much does he have to drink and how much does he have to eat to be considered by Torah standards to be a drunken and a glutton? And they come up with a ridiculously high number. Let's see. I can't quite read what Cheryl is saying. A legal directive that if a man has a stubborn, rebellious son, does not obey his father and mother. Yeah, okay. So she's just giving us, and maybe we'll start actually looking at the text next time. So basically, what the rabbis say is they do the analysis and they prove that there never was an example of this, and there never can be an example of this. So then they ask the question, so why the heck is it in the Torah? And the answer is for the merit of studying it and the logical exercise that we just went through to get to this place. Jim doesn't seem to be convinced.
Well, what I'd heard was that this was sort of the rule back then. And so to prevent a father from getting pissed off at his son and whacking him with a shovel until he's dead in the fields, now it says in another part, it says you have to take him to the court. And
yes, you take him to the gates of the city and you assemble the elders.
Yeah. And
right.
If that takes 2 or 3 days, the wife is going to find out at that point, and she's going to, oh, you're going to kill my son, you think, huh?
Well,
and
they have to take him.
All your friends are going to say, hey, my kid does the same thing. Calm down. You don't want to kill him.
Yeah, and of
so
course,
get away with it.
even in the text, it says that both parents have to bring the son to the elders at the gate of the city. And so I think what this author would say is exactly what you're saying, is the real message here is that the parent just can't decide on his own to kill his kid, that you have to go through some kind of formal process, at which point you calm down. And that's really the point that's being emphasized here. But basically what they're saying is the Torah text was never used, could never be used, which is a pretty radical idea. And we're going to see three other examples. I think it's a little after 8, and I think I think next time I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see each other. I think next time I'm going to begin with this text in Deuteronomy, and we'll actually read it because it's so much fun. I'm not that familiar with the subversive city. Oh, eye for an eye, and the moms are okay. There's other good examples here, but this stubborn and rebellious son is a perfect example of what this author is talking about, of how you'll find stuff in the Torah that, and we see this time and time again, particularly amongst fundamentalists, and I would say fundamentalist Jews, you'd say fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Muslims, who will point to a text and say, well, this is what we should be doing, and sometimes it's really horrible stuff. And you'll see there's a great example, and you can find it on YouTube of from the TV series The West Wing, where a fundamentalist is arguing about something, and the guy playing the president then starts going into these other things. Well, should you be stoned? Should you be put to death for violating the Sabbath? Okay, that's clear in the Torah. You violate the Sabbath, you should be put to death. So that probably is not something that's going to work really well in our time. And in the TV series, he just goes on example after example. Yeah.
Even ask, do I have to do it myself, or can I let the police handle it? But he's being sarcastic, obviously.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I suspect you're being sarcastic.
He doesn't say should be. He says he takes it as a given that you should be executed. He asks, do I have to kill the person myself, or can I let
Well, yeah, he is yes, he is being sarcastic. But someone, a Christian who points, let's say a fundamentalist, I'll say Jewish or Christian, who points to the Torah text as being the absolute final word on these issues, really needs to respond to the other places where clearly no one believes that violating the Sabbath, people should be put to death. So it's a good and interesting argument, and I think we'll take it up, and I thank Cheryl for finding this. Specific.
Safari has comments.
Yes, Safari
by
has a
Ibn
nice
Ezra, and that go into all of these things about, well, it can't be a teenager, it can't be this.
Yeah, I have to take a look at it. That's great. That's a key. Okay, but so we'll look at this as a great example next time. And I found an equally alarming other article that we'll read at some point, either on a Monday or a Wednesday, which is in the book of Judges. That I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Jephthah's daughter. Jephthah is a general, and he's fighting a battle, and he says, if I win this battle, I promise to God that the first thing comes out of my house to greet me when I come home, I will offer as a sacrifice. And lo and behold, it's his virgin daughter who comes to greet him. And unlike Abraham and Isaac, God doesn't stop him from sacrificing his daughter. So I found a really good and interesting article about this and how some later Jewish texts dealt with it. But you know me, I like to bring up puzzling and difficult texts just because that's the kind of rabbi I am. And so on that puzzling and difficult note.
And I like that kind that you are.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's self-selecting. If you don't like it, I will refund any funds that have been advanced.
How could you not like it? There's so much great information that you offer.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say many people don't like it because they want a simplistic understanding of the nature of God and the nature of the text. And
Okay,
they don't really want to wrestle with the text. So
right.
I'm very cognizant of this idea of we are God wrestlers. We are Yisrael. We are the people who struggle with God and struggle with the text. And I love that. So I'm just glad that I found some people who are willing to indulge me in my
No, I agree. I think it's good for me anyway to detail it out. I guess not everybody is interested in that. Okay, I understand that, but
yeah, and and I would never disparage Christianity, but I would say one of the things about Christianity is that it was Christian worship in Christian history are beautiful and accessible, even if you're not literate. Sonia and I were in Portugal, and we were in Spain, and we visited some of these amazing churches in Spain, and I visited other churches in Spain, and and in Israel, and they are breathtaking. They are powerful. I mean, you walk through them. We were just on a tour. Yeah, it was in Madrid, and they just stopped off at one of the churches, and we went inside, and it's just so beautiful, and the music and the chanting are just so beautiful and so powerful, that you can't help but be moved by it. And you don't have to know Hebrew, and you don't have to know Greek, and you don't have to be a scholar, and you don't have to be literate to be moved by the power of the architecture and the beauty. And so I think it's actually one of the things that I envy about Christianity is that they have a very powerful. I often talk about this particularly with Catholicism, is that the communion, the people lining up to participate intimately with Jesus and Jesus' sacrifice without saying a word, the soft music in the background, but it's literally on your tongue and in your mouth. It's very, very powerful. And at a Jewish service, we don't typically have that kind of, I would say, wordless spiritual power. We're so caught up in the prayers and everything. I think I've talked about this in
Silent
Ojai. Sorry, go ahead.
Silent Amida.
I'm sorry.
There's a silent Amida where you read.
Yeah. But you're actually supposed to be saying it loud enough so you hear yourself. So it's called the silent Amidah, but you're actually in the words of the prayer. Now it can be very moving. I'm not disagreeing with that. But one of the things I used to do in Ojai, where we would have typically fairly small groups, for before a Torah service, I would take the Torah scroll out of the ark, and we'd stand in a circle. This works maybe if you have 20 people or less, and we would just hand the Torah from person to person while we sing a nigun, or if there's a cantor singing something on the guitar, and it's wordless, and we're just kind of holding the Torah. I once did something I bet has never been done, and that is in Ojai, we have a Torah that's probably 200 or 300 years old, and it's like a brown leather, very different than an Ashkenazi. It's a Sephardic. I think it's a Yemenite Torah, and the outside of the text, not where the scroll is written upon, but the other side is like a soft velvet. So I once stripped the Torah naked, and we circulated this Torah while people could actually hold it and hold the skin of the Torah next to their skin, not touching the text. So, but it's very powerful, and I have that envy of that part of I've been at Christian services where they're Catholic services where there's the mass, I'm sorry, where there's the communion part of the service, and it's beautiful and it's powerful. And the symbolism I have problems with and everything else, but there's no question that it's beautiful and powerful. And churches are just beautiful and powerful, and it's moving. Les.
I think a lot of people, you were talking about how you discuss all the possibilities and what this really means. I think a lot of people seem to want absolutes. When you say this, they want an absolute. Okay, I know what I should do. And the other thing is, Christians, and my wife happens to be Christian, so it's not a criticism, but I hear them take a verse and they say this verse means, but you don't read the 5 or 6 that came before, the 10 verses afterwards, and you get the whole context. And I listen to, a lot of times, my wife on Sunday, she'll listen to David Jeremiah, and he'll say things that really infuriate me. Like one thing he says, the only way to get to God is through Jesus, through the Son. So in other words, everybody else but the people who believe as he does are all doomed. We can't get to the Father. And that's very insulting. And I tell my wife.
So let me explain to you why I don't find that insulting.
Okay.
From inside, I understand. From inside Christianity. So I think you're probably familiar with the concept, Christian concept. Jim, you're going to hold me and make sure I don't go out of bounds here. That Jesus died for everyone's sins.
Right.
Okay,
No,
you've heard of that one.
I know that. Yeah.
Okay, so what that means is for these sins, you need the atoning death of Jesus. And what you can do to atone for your own sins is not sufficient. That you may not agree with that. That's fine. But that's a Christian idea, right? It's at the heart of Christianity. Jesus' death is an atoning death for the sins of the world, right? Particularly original sin.
I understand.
So if you and I, Les, could get to heaven by virtue of just being good people, and people could get the rewards of the afterlife by being good people, then why did Jesus have to die? Right?
I agree with your logic. I understand.
Okay. So what I'm saying is the concept that this guy mentioned on radio is a direct and reasonable conclusion from the underlying basic assumption that Jesus' death is for the sins of the world. So I don't agree with it because I don't believe Jesus' death is for the sins of the world, but it's a very logical conclusion. So I don't have any problem with it.
Well, then why would they hate the Jews if we're supposed
to? Okay, let
me finish my sentence, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But I grew up with us being accused of being Christ killers.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is Christ had to die in order for him to be it. So someone had to bring him to that thing. So why are we so? I mean, that's something that had to happen. Otherwise, he wouldn't have died. He wouldn't have been crucified. So why is it where we should almost be saying, hey, wow, thank you, because he fulfilled the prophecy.
And the date of his death is called Good Friday, right? It's not Bad Friday. It's Good Friday. So the simple answer of something that's not very simple is, and this is my interpretation, certainly, the authors of the New Testament had a problem. And the problem was they were starting a religion to appeal to the world. And in their time, who was the world? The Roman Empire, right? It's very clear historically that the Romans put Jesus to death. I mean, there's no question about that. I can get into detail, but there's no question about that.
Right.
So if you're appealing with your new religion to the Roman Empire, you don't begin by saying, oh, by the way, you Romans killed God. So they had to find some way of spinning the story to shift the blame from the Romans to somebody else. And who is there? It's the Jews. And so that's the reason. Again, I'm not saying, I agree with the logic and everything, but that is actually my understanding of the reasons. And I would say since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic and most Christian movements, but not all of them, have absolutely moved away from that idea because they realized that it was that idea that was a significant element leading to the Holocaust. And so most Christian movements have gotten away from that idea, but not all. Very fundamentalist Southern Baptist Christianity has not moved away from that idea. But it's a big issue, you know. And when I work with Christians who are converting to Judaism, one big issue is, what does their family think about it? And sometimes it's very painful, because the parents of a you know, somebody converting, you know, let's just say Christian woman marries a Jewish guy, and now she is converting to Judaism, and her parents think that their grandchildren are going to hell. And that's a real problem. Whether we're going to hell or not, who the heck knows? But the fact that they're convinced of it is a real problem. I think I mentioned once I had a candidate who was a pretty serious candidate who was wanted to convert to Judaism, but his wife was so serious in her Christianity that he did not want to tell his wife that he was becoming Jewish. And I would not continue to work with him, because I wouldn't do that to a marriage. But it's a real problem. And that's why, you know, in my own book, I have I have two appendices. One is a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity, and one is a statement of Christian scholars about Judaism, which sort of refute those ideas. But it's a serious question. Another serious question is, I actually have another session I need to get to in a few minutes. So I will take my leave and wish you all a good evening, and see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
We really enjoy it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.